Boston is a Jesuit priest, ethicist, and spiritual director who is currently serving as Master of Campion Hall at the University of Oxford. Nick studied philosophy in both Bristol and Edinburgh before a spell of teaching in Surrey. In 1996, he entered the Jesuit division, and it was his long experiment working in an AIDS hospice in South Africa that had a deep impact on him. Later, he spent 2 years teaching in Guyana in South America. After pursuing a doctorate here at Boston College and teaching at Heythrop College in London, he recently published a book entitled Aquinas on Virtue with Georgetown University Press in 2017. His research spans areas such as early modern scholasticism, the virtues, and the integration of ethics and spirituality. Today, I'll be speaking on institutional spirituality and Ignatian perspective. Just one insight that I'd like to share with you. He did his dissertation on how does Thomas Aquinas, in the use of 4 causes, final, formal, material, and efficient, these 4 causes, how do they illuminate more different perspectives, if you will, on Thomas's own understanding of the virtue. And so he did this book, Aquinas on Virtue. So it looks like a casual reading, but it's also a reading, like Georgetown. And it gives you an idea of somebody who's trying to offer a variety of perspectives on something so that we can go further forward. In this presentation that he has today on institutional spirituality and Ignatian perspective, we will get a sense of what he means by institutional spirituality and what specifically is the connotation that it has in Ignatian perspective. Welcome, Nick.
So many thanks, Jim, and to the Jesuit Institute for this fellowship I've been enjoying the last 3 months here at Boston College, and also to Tomeo and the Center for Ignatian Spirituality, which it was a conversation with Tomeo that led to this topic of this talk. So, institutional spirituality and Ignatian perspective. I'm going to begin by making 3 bold guesses about everyone in this room. The first guess is that you're all involved in an institution. Okay, that's not so bold. You wouldn't be here if you weren't part of Boston College. The second guess is that in one way or another you see yourself as spiritual, or spirituality is important to you. No doubt each of us might describe that spirituality differently. So, we're all institutional beings, we're all spiritual beings. The third guess is that we don't often know how to put those 2 things together. If I'm right, I think we're all more at risk, therefore, of living divided lives. We're practicing spirituality as individuals, perhaps in small groups of like-minded individuals, but when we enter our institutions, we, along with our coat and our hat, we hang up our spirituality as we enter the door. There's a fundamental principle of Ignatian spirituality, as many of you know, that God is to be found in all things, all activities. But perhaps we're often practicing a spirituality of finding God in all things except institutions. I think one side of this divide is the counterintuitive feel of the title, institutional spirituality. I found that when I've mentioned this at St. Mary's at the lunch table to other Jesuits, I get some puzzled looks at times. Institutional spirituality, the phrase can sound a little bit like lead balloon or plastic silverware or working vacation, a kind of oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. It's assumed that there's a conflict, a dichotomy, even a contradiction between these 2. And this was confirmed when I did an electronic search for literature on institutional spirituality. There's certainly things that are relevant, but nothing that quite hit the mark of what I was looking for. So faced with this silence, one might be tempted to question whether this is a legitimate topic at all. I remember a devastating book review once said that this book fills a much-needed gap in the literature. It's the gap that was needed, not the book. And perhaps this talk is trying to fill a much-needed gap. But I think that the reason this juxtaposition of spiritual and institutional seems so counterintuitive is because of some common cultural assumptions which can be questioned. Our view of what spirituality is and our view of what institutions are and what they're like. First of all, the spiritual. As a result of a long process of secularization, we tend to see the spiritual as private, interior, very personal and individual. Many people, as we know, describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, and they may be quite happy to practice, say, mindfulness in the comfort of their own home without getting involved in the challenging business of actually being involved in a religious institution. Even spiritually minded Christians are often critical of the hierarchical or the institutional church, even while they profess a love for the pilgrim people of God. Jesus said to Nicodemus in John's Gospel, "The Spirit blows where it wills, such as all of those who are born of the Spirit." I think if you fail to turn up to work for a week or two, your line manager or your head of department might be unimpressed if you replied, "The Spirit blows where it wills." Institutions require a predictability, a stability, a certainty that seems foreign to the freedom of spirituality. But this view of spirituality, I think, can be questioned. The risk of this contemporary view is that what we might call the spiritualization of the spiritual. The spiritual becomes this purely individual, private, interior, idiosyncratic reality and lacks embodiment in communities and indeed in institutions. Simultaneously, we live in an age of anti-institutionalism, or at least skepticism, even cynicism about institutions. According to many commentators, social trust in institutions is at a very low ebb indeed. As a guest here in America, I won't comment on American institutions, but just choose a few British institutions. Parliament, the House of Lords, the British Museum, the Church of England, the police, the National Health Service. Many of these very trusted previously institutions, none of them have been free of very strong criticism in recent years. But while institutions can be a source of evil and do need to be held to account, anti-institutionalism as a blanket sweeping attitude, in my view, goes too far. The word institution is related to the Latin word instituere, to establish, to begin. What an institution does is it enables a good work that has been begun to be continued, to be scaled up, to grow. Without institutions, good works are not sustainable. So most people would agree, I think, that what we need is not no institutions, but good institutions. And this is where perhaps spirituality can help us. In any case, when we combine these two contemporary attitudes of spiritualism and anti-institutionalism, it's understandable if we find this idea of institutional spirituality counterintuitive, to say the least. And so we, at risk of being left with this divorce, this dualism, this dichotomy between spirit and body, spirituality and institution. Never the twain shall meet. But I think this is regrettable because we're left then with a spiritualized spirituality that is disembodied, and we're left with soulless institutions that lack spirit. So in this talk, I want to explore the prospects of reconciling spirituality and institutions. And as we're in a Jesuit institution, and I'm a Jesuit, I want to do this especially through the lens of St. Ignatius and Ignatian spirituality. So I want to begin with an image of St. Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Society of Jesus. There are different images that we might have of Ignatius. Sometimes he's portrayed as the soldier saint, the saint who received the cannonball in his leg in Pamplona and was converted and became a soldier for Christ. Another image is of Ignatius the pilgrim, who journeyed from Loyola to Manresa and eventually to Jerusalem, relying only on the providence of God. There's Ignatius the mystic, the author of the spiritual exercises, who received a special illumination from God while sitting on the banks of the River Cardener outside Manresa. And we also have Ignatius the apostle, who serves the dying in the hospitals and gives his clothes to the poor. But none of those images are the primary ones that I want us to consider today. If you go to the Church of the Jesuit in Rome, as I'm sure some of you have, you can go next door to the room where Ignatius used to work. And there is a desk there at which he spent most of his waking hours for the last 16 years of his life. He was the first general superior of the society. He was writing thousands of letters governing this burgeoning, newly worldwide order. He was writing the constitutions of the Society of Jesus. And I don't think we often spend enough time considering the sanctity of this Ignatius. Ignatius the founder, Ignatius the administrator. I hope it's consoling to some of the administrators in this room that you can have a saint administrator. So that's the image I propose for our consideration today. What can Ignatius at his desk teach us? In history, there have been many visionaries and charismatic founders, and the pattern tends to be that this individual figure gathers a charismatic fellowship that lives a very inspiring new form of Christian life, for example. And it's often the second generation that institutionalizes the charism. And there's always the risk at this point that the institution will kind of not let the Spirit breathe, that it will kind of snuff it out. And so later generations, reform movements, try and return to the original charism by throwing off the institutional accretions. But what's interesting in Ignatius is that he's the charismatic founder who also was the primary one responsible for institutionalizing the charism. So what we get in Ignatius, I think, is a very close relationship between the original vision and charism and spirit and the structures, the institution that he set up. And we still live as Jesuits by the constitutions that he wrote. So Ignatius is a rare thing, a spiritual figure who is also an institutional architect. And if we're looking for an institutional spirituality, Ignatius is a good person to look at. Ignatius, of course, was primarily concerned with setting up the Society of Jesus, but as we know from experience and from history, the Ignatian charism has been embodied in many, many different institutions in different times and places. Universities, colleges, schools, parishes, refugee centres, retreat centres, the list could go on. The Ignatian spirit is a bit like a Shakespeare play. that can be performed faithfully by different actors in different contexts, totally different versions of the same play, all of them faithful, but each of them creatively adapting to their own time. So what can we learn from Ignatius about how this Ignatian charism can be incarnated, embodied in diverse groups and institutions? So I'm going to suggest 3 investigative themes for an institutional spirituality from this Ignatian perspective. The 3 themes are body, spirit, and structures. Body, spirit, and structures. So first of all, the body of an institution. I think it helps to rewind back to 1539 when the Company of Jesus was a charismatic fellowship of 10 companions, Ignatius Loyola, Francis Xavier, Pierre Favre, and others. And they'd already shared a life together for about 5 years. They'd all experienced the spiritual exercises. They'd taken vows of poverty and chastity. They were doing ministries as priests, preaching, giving the sacraments. Some of them were teaching theology, places like Venice and Rome. And they had all had this sort of missionary spirit. So they were about to offer themselves to the Pope to be distributed anywhere in the rapidly expanding known world, wherever the need was greatest. But it is at this point in Rome that they face a crisis, because if they're going to be sent to Turkey or to Africa or to the New World, what will become of their fellowship? So they meet together to discern what to do about this. And their first question, let me quote it, is, would it be more advantageous for us to be so joined and united into one body that no physical separation of our persons, be it ever so great, could divide our hearts? So they're asking, shall we form a single body that can still somehow exist even if we're missionaries dispersed all over the world? And they find this first question relatively easy to resolve, because what they notice is that despite their diversity, they're from different nations, different cultures, some of them at war with each other. Despite that, there's this strong bond of union between them, which they therefore attribute to a gift. It's something they've received. It's not something they could generate themselves. And so they see it as a gift from God. So if God has given them this gift of union, they shouldn't separate. So they make the choice to form a single body. Now, this image of a body is quite important, I think. When Tomeo sent the advertisement for this talk round, he had a picture of skyscrapers rather intimidatingly looming above us, crushing the individual in their vast perspective. That's the image of an institution as a building. And it's a common image that is used, whether literally or metaphorically. But Ignatius's controlling image, his primary metaphor for thinking about the institution of the Society of Jesus, is not of a building, but of a body, a living organism, something much more dynamic, able to move, to respond, to grow. And the image of the body, of course, has scriptural roots, but also roots in the political philosophy of his day. St. Paul described the church as a body, each part having its own role to play. And throughout the constitutions, Ignatius uses this image of the body and develops it at length. To enter the Society of Jesus for him is not to enter a building, it's to be incorporated into a body. So it's about this transition from me to us, becoming part of something bigger than myself, belonging, sharing, participating in an entity that is greater than myself. Quite a challenging idea for our individualistic mindset today. Now, I wonder if this kind of image could be used for an institution like Boston College or Campion Hall, where I live and work. This idea that an institution is a living, breathing organism, a body. I think the traditional word for this in academia is fellowship. I'm currently a visiting fellow here. So there are remnants of this in academic life today. In Oxford, every academic is a fellow of a college. And it's the fellowship that governs that college. I think for the most part, we've forgotten that this word has quite deep spiritual roots. If we go back to St. Paul's writings, fellowship is a translation of the word koinonia. Faithful God, he says in 1 Corinthians, who have called us into the fellowship of his only Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Those words are inscribed into the image of Ignatius in the entrance hall to Campion Hall. So this idea of fellowship is a union between people who have a cause for deeper unity, a deeper commitment. In the case of the early Christians, what they experienced was this koinonia, this union of hearts and minds because of their relationship to Jesus Christ. But in an academic context, can we have an academic fellowship still today in which this sort of a deeper commitment of some kind unites us together into a body, so that we're not just academics with flexible working who occasionally come into office, deliver our lectures and go home again, but that we are a fellowship together? I think that's the question. Incidentally, the word fellowship is translated into Latin in the Vulgate Bible as societas, society. So when the early Jesuits called themselves the Society of Jesus, I think they were referring to this, the fellowship of Jesus, the koinonia of Jesus. So there's a sort of resonance there between what the early companions experienced as a gift and what St. Paul talked about, the early Christians experiencing this sense of union of hearts and minds between them. So is there a way in which we can live that intentionally in institutions today? The second theme is spirit, because Ignatius spends a lot of time asking how we can preserve this union of hearts and minds, how we can preserve the body, how individuals can gradually be incorporated into this body in the long process, for example, of Jesuit formation. But he makes an intriguing comment that it's not enough to preserve the body of the institution. It's also necessary to preserve and to grow its spirit. So what is the spirit of an institution? He's not here talking about the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity, but something much more particular. For him, the Benedictines have a particular spirit, and the Dominican order has a particular spirit, and so does the Society of Jesus. And it's worth asking, well, what about Boston College or Campion Hall or St. Ignatius Parish or many other institutions? Do they too have their own particular spirits? It's not perhaps a way we're used to thinking. So I'm just going to make a couple of suggestions, sort of ways into this idea of the spirit of an institution. This one's a little bit out of left field, if I've got the baseball metaphor right. You'll have to forgive me if I haven't. So the first one is, I love this idea of the genius loci from Roman society. A lot of archaeology has dug up many, many altars in different, buildings, homes, temples, other places. Each place had its own spirit of the place, the genius, the spirit of the place. And so an altar was built to reverence, to pray to beg the favor of the spirit that dwelled in that place. And if the sacrifices weren't made or the prayers weren't offered, the risk was that the spirit would sort of turn against that place. So it's important to placate and to ask the favor of the genius loci. It's interesting that in the 20th century and more recently, there's been a little bit of a recovery in various different fields of this idea of genius loci, perhaps most notably in architecture, where some architects deliberately set out to produce a building that respects the spirit of the place, or the landscape gardening, for example. But in art, in ecology, and in spirituality, others have been trying to recover this idea. I think we could get distracted into metaphysical questions about what exactly the nature of the genius loci is. Am I seriously saying there's a personal being dwelling in Boston College, for example, a spiritual being? Or is it more that it's a kind of holistic property where the whole is greater than its parts, that you get a sense of from walking around on campus, by attending lectures, by taking part in the life of the university? You get a sense that there's something here that is more than just the sum of its parts. But I think we do have this experience, don't we, of the spirit of the place. If you're in downtown Boston, there's a different feel to the place than, say, Chestnut Hill. Perhaps more dramatically, if you experience the place of a terrible battle, you may have a feel of even perhaps not knowing initially that that's the place where this battle took place, that this place has a sort of feel of terror and grief about it. Or, on the contrary, walking into an ancient chapel, the feel of peace that you have there. So there's a sort of way in which we sense what the spirit of a place is, and perhaps similarly the spirit of an institution. A more conventional way into this idea, I think, is the idea of charism. A charism in the Christian tradition is a gift given to empower for a specific service, a gift given to perhaps particular individuals to empower them for a specific service. But it's also applied to religious orders, and it's also nowadays applied to institutions. So according to this, each institution has a charism. There's a kind of gift that comes with each institution that enables it to perform its special role, its special function. And you get a sense of the distinctive charism of each institution, especially through its history, perhaps especially through its founding. But it can change and develop over time. If you look to your left over there, I think that painting was an attempt of its time to capture, to express, to evoke the spirit of Boston College. And at first sight, that's not a particularly promising image for us today. You have an image, is either St. Peter or could even be God the Father, but it's probably St. Peter, with all of the male sort of great figures of the church around him. In the back, there seems to be St. Peter's in Rome. So it's a sort of ultramontanist image of Catholicism as the sort of spirit of Boston College. Not exactly the synodal church, you might think. But it is interesting that if you look at the shields around the painting, you have the different disciplines, history and music and poetry and philosophy and so on, and theology, and right at the top, sapientia, wisdom. So I had this conversation with Greg Calshaw, Father Greg Calshaw, who said, there's a sense of all of these disciplines at the service of wisdom, seeking wisdom. Now that is still an interesting vision for academic life today. What if we didn't just have siloed academic disciplines, completely fragmented and separate from each other, but we saw each discipline as somehow part of a bigger conversation in which together we're searching for a more integrated vision of reality. We're searching not just for knowledge, but for wisdom. And that's part of the Catholic Jesuit tradition, that's what all of the disciplines serve. In some way, they serve a growth in wisdom. And wisdom is what a mission for an academic research institution, to serve wisdom in a particular society. There are other ways in which other aspects of the original founding spirit of Boston College we might point to. As my understanding is, it was founded for the Irish immigrant population who were really excluded from higher education elsewhere in the locality. Now, that's not the need for today, but that spirit of serving the marginalized, if that's not honored, if that's not reverenced, if that's not served today, then there would be the risk that the institution loses its spirit, I would say. And we do see it expressed in various ways, like, for example, the Pulse course, in which students are formed in these values of service and social justice and going out and making a contribution in society. Or Messina College, that gives that opportunity for a Boston College education that would be inaccessible and affordable to them, unlike their more wealthy peers. So the spirit changes and adapts according to the needs of the time, but in some ways recognizably the same. Otherwise, the institution will lose its vivifying principle. The third theme is that of structures, and it's puzzling to some. Why did Ignatius and the early companions not just choose to form a body, but then go on to choose a superior, structure their fellowship together according to the structures of an institution, ask the Pope to confirm them as a religious order, which is what they institutionalized the charism? Why did they take this path rather than remain as a charismatic fellowship? I think the simple answer is they did remain as a charismatic fellowship. The point of the institution was precisely to enable them to do that, because without those structures, the charismatic fellowship would have been at risk of dissipating, of running like water into the sand. What the structures enable the charism to do is to be sustained, to enable you to invite others into that same charism and to scale it up. So really what Ignatius and the early companions aimed for in writing the constitutions and so on was to preserve the charism. The charism, the spirit of the society, was the central thing, and its fellowship, its body. So how can we have structures that serve the body and spirit of the society? And I think that Ignatius's particular genius was therefore to create what you might call structures of spirit. A little metaphor that might help understand what I'm trying to get at. I remember as a child being fascinated by an image I found in an encyclopedia that my parents had. It was an image of what a human body would look like if it didn't have any bones. And it was this sort of blob on the floor with two eyeballs sticking out. So although the human body is a very dynamic and fluid thing, mostly made of liquid, the bones are absolutely essential to it. And in particular, if you take the ribs have this function of protecting the vital organs, but also facilitating the lungs in their breathing. And the ribs kind of are flexible to allow for that expansion and contraction. And so I think the structures that Ignatius sets up are a bit like the ribs of a body rather than the sort of iron girders of a building. They're flexible, they're designed to protect the charism, to give the body space to breathe its spirit, as it were. Just on the flexibility of the rules and structures Ignatius set up, which are famous and drive some people up the wall when Jesuits, always find I once had at Campion Hall, we used to have a bursar who was from the army, and he he said, look, here, everything's an exception, he said. Every time you come to a decision, you don't just stick to the rule, you make an exception. Well, that's Jesuit discretion or discernment. It's always trying to find it's not a sort of, it's not relativism, it's actually an escalation of objectivity, as Steve Pope would put it. That it's a way of trying to find what's most fitting to a particular circumstance. So there's this flexibility, this spirit of flexibility that's very characteristic of the Jesuits and tends to drive our Dominican brothers up the wall. Just an example, Jesuit novices have to perform 6 experiences or placements. And he gives a list of what they are: pilgrimage and doing the spiritual exercises, serving the poor in the hospital, etc., etc. He says, when the superior approves, these experiences may be advanced, postponed, adapted, and in some case replaced by others according to persons, times, and places with their contingencies. So in other words, the superior has this sort of freedom to make the good judgment for that particular person in that context. So there is a rule, but it always has this room to breathe within it. And I think the most important structures that Ignatius sets up are those that help institutional decision-making. Now, the caricature of institutional decision-making in the Society of Jesus that you get from Wikipedia is that it's very military and top-down. There's the general, there's the provincial, there's the individual Jesuit, and he gets sent anywhere in the world, and he promises total obedience and availability. Now, that's not entirely false, but most of you who know Jesuits like myself will know that we're not actually quite like that. But more importantly, Ignatius builds into this structure structures of bottom-up, structures of listening, of attending to individuals. One of the most notable one is the provincial superior, so responsible for all the Jesuits within a particular territory. One of his main jobs is simply to go around to the different communities and listen to each Jesuit for about an hour each year. So it's not the superior there listening. It's not the subject listening to the superior, the normal image of authority. It's the person in authority listening to the subject. And there are many other structures that Ignatius set up of communication from the ground up all the way to Rome, to Father General in Rome, through various consultors and congregations and advisors and so on. Almost like a sort of nervous system stretching out from Rome across the globe through all of the Jesuits, sending signals out and receiving them back again. The Society of Jesus is sometimes described as the first truly global organization in the early modern period. And even today, it's quite striking how global an organization it is. But it's because of these structures of spirit that Ignatius puts in place. And it's because he believes that if we're to really listen to where the Spirit is moving, if we're to be attentive to that, we have to create these structures where we can devote time to quality listening to each other. Okay, so I'll draw to a close now. I've pulled out 3 themes, as it were, for an institutional spirituality from the perspective of an Ignatian perspective. The idea that an institution is not to be visioned as a building, but more as a living organic body in which the individual participates, belongs to a whole greater than himself or herself. The idea of a particular spirit, charism for each institution that needs to be fostered and honored and grown over time. And this idea that we do need these flexible structures of spirit, especially when it comes to decision making, that provide the space to truly listen to the deepest concerns and realities of the participants. Just one final thought. At the end of the constitutions, Ignatius doesn't exhort us to trust the institution. What he exhorts us to do is to hope. And the reason for his hope is that he believes that the Holy Spirit is at work in the institution. That's the same Holy Spirit he experienced on the banks of the River Cardinal, the Spirit at work in the hearts of each person. Again, the Wikipedia version of Ignatius is that he was a sort of counter-Reformation saint, an uber-Catholic who defended the fortress of the Catholic Church against the Protestants. That was really the last thing on his mind. For the most part, he was trying not to be accused by the Inquisition of being a heretic himself. What he was a reformer, however. He saw that there were serious things wrong with the institution of the church. The religious orders had fallen into disrepute, and he was especially concerned about ambition, wealth, and power, the privilege of the clergy and the episcopacy at the time. And that was one of his main motivations for founding the Society of Jesus, that would be, in his hope, would be free of that ambition, that spirit of ambition. And Jesuits still take a vow against ambitioning in the church. So he was a reformer. So he was critical of the institution of the church in that sense, but he didn't give up on it and just form his own alternative charismatic group. So I think for us today, at a time when we might be tempted to give up hope in institutions, this exhortation not to blind trust but to hope is very apposite. We're not asked to have a naive trust in institutions. Institutions need to be held to account. But it's not all up to us. There is a deeper force at work for the good in each institution. Its spirit, its particular spirit, and according to Ignatius, the Holy Spirit as well. And that ultimately is the basis for hope in institutions. I'll finish there so that we have some time for conversation. So please, is Jim going to... yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So I ask that if you have a question or a comment, that you raise your hand and you identify yourself and then post the question or comment. Nick? There's a microphone there.
Hello, Mick McCarthy. An old boy of Campion Hall, and I work at the Clough School of Theology and Ministry. Thank you very much for bringing up the whole question of institutionality, and particularly spirituality. A question and maybe a worry that I have is, the way I'd formulate it is what's the difference between spirituality and culture? I think a lot of what you said about spirituality, or even spirit, I wonder if we could actually just use the word culture, and we do talk about institutional cultures, but there's something in me that wants to believe that spirit means something more. And I just wonder if you have any reflections on that.
Sure. Yeah, so that's a good question. I think I want to hold out for this distinction between the spirit of an institution and the Holy Spirit. And I think both are ultimately important, but our institutions are pluralistic. You know, they're composed of people from different faith perspectives and from none. And the idea of spirit, I think, helps us to invite people into a kind of spirituality that is inclusive in a pluralistic culture. But it doesn't neglect the deeper Christian roots of a particular charism. So just to give an example, if you take the Jesuit refugee service, for example, it expresses its spirit in 3 verbs: to accompany, to advocate, to serve, and to advocate. Now, there are many refugee organizations that serve and advocate. To serve, they meet the material needs, for example, of the people who come to them. They advocate for people through legal representation or political representation, asylum seekers, forced migration, people in forced migrants, and so on. But it is somewhat distinctive of Jesuit refugee service and perhaps other faith organizations that they put this accent on accompaniment, journeying with, being present to the other person. It's a more relational practice that undergirds their whole approach, even to service and to advocacy. Now, if you were to ask the founders of JRS and the Jesuits who run it today, they would probably say that there's a deep theological basis for that, and a spiritual basis, that in the spiritual exercises, what we experience is that God looks at the mess that is in the world and doesn't decide to sort it all out from on high. He doesn't remain on his throne and, with a wave of his divine arm, sort the problem out. Rather, he chooses to become enfleshed. He chooses to become Emmanuel, God with us, this embodied presence. This is the mode in which God saves us, redeems us, is the mode of walking with us, sharing our lives, this relational way of redeeming, reconciling. So if that's our experience of God, then we too are called to accompany others, to walk with them, to attend to them, to be with them, even before we try and meet their needs or advocate for them. So you can give a very specifically Christian rationale for accompaniment, but I think it's also true that many, many people who work for JRS around the world are Muslims or atheists or different faith perspectives. They can get a sense of the spirit of JRS and be very deep practitioners of accompaniment. They can get it, sort of thing, even though they're not Christian. There's a twist there as well, because you might be a practicing Catholic, a very good Catholic, and not get that spirit of accompaniment. You might be sort of tone deaf to it, if you like. So there's this sort of paradox that even though the deepest root of this practice of accompaniment may lie in Christian revelation, it's accessible, it's open, it's accessible to a sort of pluralistic participation. And I think that's why I'm trying to honor 2 things. For example, that Boston College is a Jesuit Catholic institution, and secondly, that there are many wonderful people here who aren't Catholics who nevertheless get the spirit of Boston College and make a huge contribution. So it's a way of trying to hold those 2 poles together.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Kevin Kane, and thank you very much. I'm very intrigued by how you talked about structures and led to structures as well, and brought through Ignatian thinking in that process. I have a hard question, though. If your structures are not Ignatian, Jesuit-based, if they're not Jesuit Refugee Corps, if they're not Boston College, etc., is there anything in the process that you saw of Ignatius writing about and leading to the organization as well that can be of any help to the many other structures that so many of us are involved in? Where does the hope come from that? And is it simply reliant on sole individuals that are a part of those organizations? Does that make sense?
So the structures, the other structures being within or
a structure
national...
can include a mega corporation, a Fortune 500. It could include a mom and pop organization. It could include a nonprofit that is not Ignatian. So in that great big world of organizations out there, how might we think through it in an Ignatian way?
Yeah.
Good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. So Ignatius had a very high view of the Society of Jesus in the sense that he thought that God founded the Society of Jesus. He began it. He's the hope that will enable it to continue. Whatever we think of that, it's an interesting thing to ask of any institution, is there a sort of basic core that is good? And in Christian theology, the problems come when an entity sort of wanders from its core identity. It's a kind of distortion of the good that causes the problem. So there's always the possibility on that view of calling it back to that good core. So even business institutions, I don't see a reason why you couldn't, I sort of think of British examples, say take Marks and Spencer's. It's a sort of supermarket and clothes department store in the UK. Many British people love that institution. Okay, at times it's wandered away from its core sort of mission, if you like. But it's at its best when it's really serving a wide group of society with good quality, affordable sort of thing. So you can see that even mundane business organizations, you could say, well, there's a particular spirit to Marks and Spencer's at its best that we want to aspire to. And I think the one way into this question of spirit is that question: what is this institution like at its flourishing best? And that's the sort of good spirit of the organization, which you can work for whichever institution you're in. Now, there may be some institutions that are unredeemable. I don't know, the mafia, for example. But I think we can be quite broad in our sense of what institutions have spirit.
In as much as we have about 90 seconds before 2 o'clock, I think it's time for us to thank you.